Hello! I am Raphael Bob Waxberg, and I am here with...
Will Arnett.
and this is Season 1, Episode 2, BoJack Hates the Troops
Yeah.
of BoJack Horseman. So this episode...
We want to get into wasting booze. That was the big... No, that was not the...
this is Judy Greer here as Pam. I remember we did the table reads of the first two episodes together.
Yeah.
Will.
Mm-hmm.
And so because Judy Greer was not in the first episode, she came late. We didn't want to pay her for the first one, so she came like right on time to come for the second one.
I don't remember that part of it.
I remember because there was an awkward moment that you kind of saved the day, that she just kind of slunk in and was like, okay, I guess we're going to keep going. You said, Judy Greer, everybody, and everyone applauded.
Yes, I do remember that.
Which is very nice.
Yeah.
Because everyone else had been introduced at the beginning of the first table read.
Yeah, and I've known Judy for a long time, from Arrested Development, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And I always feel like, somebody like Judy needs to be introduced.
Yes, I think
she's a great...
well and good.
Yeah, and it should be noted, there was no malice on your part.
No, we weren't trying to snub her.
No, it wasn't a snub. It wasn't a classic Hollywood snub.
Not a classic Hollywood snub.
No. But now this particular scene that it opens with was also in the original
pilot presentation. Yes, this is one of the... So, the first episode we ever recorded was a pilot presentation, which was like a 10-minute version of this episode.
Yeah.
Was that the first script you got, Will, or do you remember if you got both scripts when we put the offer out, or was it just the presentation script?
I think it was just the presentation script.
What were your first impressions of the script or this project as it came to you? Do you remember?
I thought, how can I help these guys out?
Oh.
No, I thought, no. Truthfully,
a charity case.
Yeah. No, we have, you and I share, we have sort of representation people in common, and they got it to me and said, you just read this.
So they are good for something.
They are good for something, it turns out. And they didn't really give me any context.
Uh-huh.
And they just sent it to me, and I actually got a physical copy of it. I remember that, because now, of course, we read
through
most
email,
stuff through email. But I got a physical...
This was right on the cusp.
Yeah, right on the...
2014.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it was just the way it went
Yeah.
with that particular one. And I remember reading it and thinking, immediately laughing.
Oh, good.
Yeah. I just... And as soon as... And it wasn't very long. And
Yeah.
and as soon as I was finished, I called Peter Principato and I just said, yes, I want to do this. And it was like, you guys were making it, and it was just a presentation, and there was no buyer, and blah, 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 but we're just going to go. I was like, great, yeah, I'm in.
Yeah.
And I knew very little about it, and then they told me that Amy was doing it, Aaron was doing it, and Amy, I didn't know Aaron.
Yeah.
I'd known Amy Sedaris for a few years at that point.
How do you know Amy? Just from around? Just from comedy stuff? Or did you work on something together?
Kind of around. She's really good friends with Justin Thoreau, who's an old friend of mine. Who really wanted to be on the show, but I never let him get a part.
You wouldn't allow it.
I wouldn't allow it. There were a lot of people who asked me, and I'd say, yeah, sure. Yeah. And then I just never...
You come to me and say, don't you dare.
Don't you. But there were times sometimes where I would mention to you people who would ask about
it.
Yeah.
We got a few friends of yours and Aaron's and into the show.
So anyway, so that's how we got into it. But immediately it was just based on the script and how funny it was. And I remember recording over at Margarita Mix here in Hollywood, just across the street there. And it was all you guys in the room there.
Yeah, it was at the time. I think the first record was everyone. It was like me and Noel and Steve, the producers. I think Mike Hollingsworth was probably there.
Yes. I think Michael Eisner was there too.
Probably, yeah.
And then you had just
we were very excited, Will.
No, but you had just recorded Amy via
over the phone.
Patch. Yeah. Anyway, it went well, and it was great, and I knew Patton a little bit. And who else was in it? I knew
Oberman?
Keith Oberman a little bit.
Did you actually?
Strangely enough, yeah, I'd played fantasy football for a couple of years
that
with
makes
Keith
sense.
Oberman.
I believe that.
Yeah, because he and Bateman are old friends.
Uh-huh.
God knows how. Thank God, by the way, thank you for doing me the service of never putting Bateman in the
Not
show.
once.
Yeah, because that's just, it would have spelt the end.
Well, I did actually... we were conscious about trying to avoid some of those obvious cameos, especially early on. Like, I mean,
Sure.
I guess Judy Greer we had, but we didn't want to have the whole Breaking Bad crew or the whole Arrested Development crew come in. We wanted this to feel like it's standing on its own as its own thing.
Yeah. Although it would have been good to have a show that they watched that was a competing show that was really good that had Bryan Cranston and Bateman in it.
Yeah.
That they had their own show.
What?
Do you not follow me?
No.
that BoJack watches a show, and the stars of that show are Bryan Cranston and
that would
Jason
be fun.
Bateman.
Yes.
See what I mean?
I see. Well, maybe it's not too late.
It feels like it's too late.
Might be too, that ship might have sailed.
It feels like the only thing it is too late.
That's all that is.
Yeah.
Is too late. So this episode, so I wrote the first episode of the show, BoJack Horseman story chapter, or whatever that episode was called. Tornante had asked me to write this thing for them that I pitched to them.
Mm-hmm.
This story all exists somewhere. You can read an interview somewhere.
Yeah.
But the short version is I pitched the show to Tornante, and they said, okay, well, let's put together a little presentation. So I wrote this whole first episode.
Tornante is the production company.
Yes.
The company that owns the show.
Yes, and that's when I sometimes refer to Noel and Steve. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So I'd written this whole script, and I remember their initial reaction to the first script I wrote was, I don't know, we love the idea. I don't know if this gets us into the world enough or kind of shows the potential of what the show could be. And I'd pitched out a couple other episodes, including this BoJack Hates the Troops one. And they said, we really like this pitch. Is there a way to get some of that energy into the first one? And I was so green, I didn't know what I was doing. So I'm just going to write another script. I don't know how to take notes. So I just wrote, which I would say...
You just write your way out of it.
Right, yeah, write a whole... Which is not great for my deal, because I was being paid to write one script.
Sure.
So I would not advise people do this, but it worked for me. That's me and Mike Hollingsworth, these two dogs. Mm-hmm. But I wrote this whole second script, and I said, what do you think of this one? See, this now I wanted to give you the context so you'll understand the first one a little better. And they go, okay, yeah, this one's great. Is there a way to make this the pilot? Like, maybe we don't need the whole first one. And because this feels more like an episode of television.
Yeah.
And I think at that time we didn't know where we were going to sell it to and kind of what it was going to be. And I think when we ended up selling it to Netflix, it made sense to kind of go back to the first one, because the first one really sets up the arc of the season in the show.
Right.
Whereas if you're thinking of it more as like a week-to-week kind of thing, this is maybe a better way in, where it's just kind of like, here's an episode of television with the beginning, middle, and end, where BoJack gets into a little bit of a misadventure.
Yeah.
And so then that's why we ended up using this for the pilot presentation. And in some ways, I think it has what a lot of episode 2s have, which is kind of like a repilot, like it kind of re-explains who everybody is and everyone's relationship. And I think some of that is held over from when I tried to make this the pilot.
Oh, interesting. So not only is it held over, but it actually works anyway.
Yes.
Despite the fact that it's held over, it's very functional.
I think so.
Yeah, I agree with you. And this is the scene, obviously,
yes.
that in the presentation that really was a serious sort of comedy scene that I understood.
Yeah.
A guy who he's kind of bitter. He uses his own whatever sort of
celebrity.
Well, no, I was going to
power.
say celebrity, but I was also going to say that his own weakness is used against him by himself. Like it's just like it's so layered. He does it to spite the other guy.
Right. He'd rather screw the other guy over, even though it helps himself zero.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, if anything, it just injures himself.
Yes. That is a very true key to his character.
Yes.
Several seasons later, that is kind of...
Absolutely. And it really, that was the moment that really stuck
You're like,
with me.
I get this.
Yeah.
I know how to play this.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And then he goes right into this scene where he's interviewing Diane. Or not interviewing.
She's interviewing him.
Interviewing him.
And this, here we get the first flashback to the parents. And so I think in some ways also this episode, I feel like there's kind of a secret story to this episode. Like the main plot is like the BoJack Hates the Troops thing, which is very standalone-y and like never comes back in any way and doesn't really matter. And even BoJack taking this political stand isn't really a thing that would continue with his character moving forward. But I think the secret story here is that he's, learning how to open up to this woman interviewing him, and we're getting little bits of hints of his childhood, and then the end of the episode, he does open up to her. And that, to me, always felt like that's what this is really about, and that's how we're moving him along this axis this season. And I think early on, it was a challenge to figure out how to serialize this story, or how to indicate that it was serialized, because I think the assumption in the audience was that every episode was kind of its own thing. Mm-hmm. And how do we sell this idea? Like, I remember talking to Netflix about it, because they were big pushers of like, yeah, we want to feel like the story is moving forward. And my argument at the time was like, it is. Like, that's like episode 1, he agrees to do this book. episode 2, he's like hiding from her, and then he decides to open up, and that is the movement. But the troop stuff is much louder, and so you'd be forgiven for not noticing that necessarily.
Yes, yeah. And I think that because the troop stuff is so much louder, what happens is, what's interesting is when those first initial reviews came out of the show,
Right.
they focused on things like this, and they said, oh, it's just another show about a
Right.
guy who's a celebrity.
They
or
didn't
whatever.
notice this building that was happening.
That's absolutely right. And which is one of the sweetest, a thing that's so rare in what we do.
Uh-huh.
That sweet taste of revenge. When a bunch of reviewers
Go, oh, I was wrong?
oh, I was wrong, and had to eat their words.
It's not revenge. They didn't eat their words.
They ate their words, and then we got revenge.
Did we get, what was the revenge exactly?
I don't know, but I felt like, I felt like in that moment. Like a
we showed 'em.
Sicilian, you know.
We tricked you. You thought our show was bad, but it was good. Now you appear foolish, and you had to watch it.
Yeah, exactly.
And you liked it. Take that.
Again, you're making it a joke, but it's actually true.
It did feel good.
It did feel good. Let's not.
But I didn't think of it as revenge. I thought like,
No, I know. It's
oh,
not
these are the
revenge.
people that I wanted to like it. I'm glad they came around and like it now.
Agreed.
But you also, I'm curious, because you were in many ways the first audience for this show, because we didn't tell you where we were. Like we said, yeah, here it is, and then as the season progressed and it gets darker and more serious and more clearly serialized. Do you remember like your first impressions when you realized, this is what the show is?
Well, you probably remember. I mean, I would. We do table reads, and so we'd all be there here in the office and doing these table reads. But also it was those moments, and table reads are very different because sometimes it's the first time you're seeing it, or it's the first time you're saying it out loud. And then the next week when we come in to record it, we'd have those moments, and we'd dig out those moments, and you'd sort of push me to like, oh, just remember this, and try to get it. Let's get more of a sense of this, and this is happening with BoJack, and don't forget. And we would start to see different layers and different things kind of coming up, and I would increasingly get kind of uncomfortable as certain things would come up, and we'd talk about it, and I'm sure you remember vividly over the years of constantly going, "Geez, man," I'd leave a session here, and I'd be like, "What the fuck?" Dude? Like I remember being over in England working on something, and we did it even via phone or whatever, and like I remember the engineer on the other side there, and I was in Wales, and he was like, man, that's really heavy.
What is this show you're doing?
Are you okay? But yeah, but I loved it. I loved that seeing it kind of roll out really slowly.
Yeah.
You don't get an opportunity to do that a lot. And you're right that it's great that Netflix did want to do that. And I don't know if it's the same now, but certainly we got to work at Netflix at a time kind of in their infancy of original programming, and they didn't. Right, they didn't kill you with notes, or they weren't speeding along.
They gave a handful of notes, like any network does, but I'd say on the lighter side, and also helpful. And I think that the main thing I realized with Netflix very early on, compared to other networks where I've worked on shows, is it always felt like Netflix wanted to help me make the show that I wanted to make, the show that I pitched, the show that I sold. And so all their notes were kind of in service of that, of like, hey, this joke feels a little more Family Guy, or this feels more in this direction. Is that what you want to be doing? Or sometimes it would just be like, hey, this joke didn't work for us, whatever. But I've worked on other shows where it feels like, oh, they bought this show over here, but what they really wanted was that show over there.
Yeah.
And all of their notes are trying to drag the show over there, and that never works.
It never works, and in fact, I think you're right. And again, I don't know what it's like now necessarily, but I can only speak to. First of all, I remember when we were going out with the show and sending it out, and Tornante was trying to find a buyer, a distributor, and it kept getting kind of close at various places, and it looked like, well, it might not happen.
Yeah.
Nobody gets it or whatever. And it did fall in a weird place. It's tough to see this in prime time, especially now knowing where the show goes,
Right.
All the different levels. I don't know if it would work necessarily. And then Netflix, I'd gotten to know Ted Sarandos at Netflix, and we'd done Arrested Development. Kind of right at that time, we'd just finished shooting the fourth season of Arrested Development, and he and I were good friends. And he called me up and he said, I think we're going to do this BoJack Horseman show. What do you think? I said, yeah, that's great.
What do you think? You're in it?
Yeah, literally. That's the way it used to be back then. It was very kind of mom and pop. And I said, that's great. And I go, yeah. He goes, yeah, we're going to do it. I think it's really funny. And he picked it up for the right reasons in that they just liked it.
Yes.
And they weren't trying to tell you how to make a show like you were saying. Yeah. He was just like, I like what you're writing.
I felt very strongly coming out of the pitch meeting with Netflix, which Ted wasn't in that meeting, but it was Cindy and Blair. I don't remember who else was in
Jane
there.
Jane
wasn't there yet. Andy wasn't there yet. But I remember feeling like I did a good job in the pitch, but less that I sold this great show, and more that like I sold myself as like a smart guy with good ideas, the kind of guy that should have a TV show. You know, I feel like that's what they're like. Oh yeah, this guy knows what he's talking about. Let's see what this guy has to do.
Well, I mean, yes, and also you had a good product. You had a great presentation.
We went and loaded because we had this 10-minute presentation they'd seen. We had Lisa's artwork. We had you and Aaron attached already. And then I had a pitch of like, here's the 12 episodes I want to make this season. I pitched through the entire season, episode by episode, and some of that ended up changing a little bit when we actually broke it with the writers' room. Yeah. But you could see that arc of like, and it ends exactly in the place that I pitched it in that first meeting. So I knew what I wanted to do with it. I think I thought about, like, I spent a weekend thinking, like, okay, what makes a good Netflix show if I'm going to pitch it to Netflix, right? And I pitched it to a couple places, and I tried to, like, think about for these specific places. And at that point, it had only been, like, Arrested and House of Cards and Orange is the New Black. Yeah. And I guess Hemlock Grove at that point were the only shows.
That's right.
Right? And so I thought about, like, well, you know, of those that I'd seen, what did they do well? And I thought, oh, they're really leaning into the serialization thing. And you don't see that a lot in animated comedy. So can we surprise people by doing that? And that's what my pitch kind of centered around, is like, we're going to tell this long seasonal story in the same way that your hour-long dramas do, or Arrested did, too.
Yeah. And let me ask you this, just seeing this, it would occur to me, if you pitched it now, would you have it less TV-centered and more about social media that the outrage breaks out?
Although it's hard because... we still do have these like kind of fast cuts of like, what are the man on the street saying, which feels outmoded, but it's like so much more cinematic than like a scrolling Twitter feed.
Of course.
And occasionally like writers have pitched like, yeah, we're going to go into the social networking thing. I'm like, ugh, no, on your next show you can do that. I understand that's the future, but it just tires me.
No, and
I know that's how it really works, but
it's just occurred to me that we've become so much less cinematic as a people. We're such boring subjects, aren't we, us human beings?
Well, I think we've found new ways to cinematize text messaging and Twitter, and like
but I mean just our lives in general.
We're less fun to look at.
Yeah, we're less fun to look at. It's just people staring at screens.
Yes.
You know, and like a romance now is just two people texting each other.
Yeah, gross.
Fucking gross.
How dare
us. But then the other thing what was I gonna say about about the show getting so then the show, I remember not in this episode, so I don't want to, but it is in this season. I remember at the end of the first season, there was a lot of controversy about a certain line that some of the producers didn't want to use.
Was it the September 11th one?
Yeah.
That's in episode 4. It's not even the end of the season. It's like 2 episodes from now.
No, in the season, I said.
In the season.
Yeah.
Yes, there was a little back and forth.
The controversy with it in our little world. And remember, we had to go back and re-record the line.
So I'll
you explain it.
Yeah, so you don't out anybody or make anybody and get any.
You see how good I am at this, right?
Very good. So there was some concern from somebody up top, and I won't say where. There's a line where BoJack says to Todd in 2 episodes, he's talking about a rock opera, and he says that was, and I don't put this lightly. I don't say this lightly. Worse than 100 September 11ths. Yeah. And so for me, the comedy comes from, and I don't say this like that. He's considered this phrase, and he wouldn't say it unless he definitely meant it.
He really meant
worse than 100 September 11ths.
Yeah.
And so there was, and it was that, and there's also another line in that same episode about it's worse than if the Holocaust happened every 4 years like the Olympics. Right. So I think between the two of those, there was some pushback, like, do we really need both these lines? And actually, the writer of that episode, Peter Knight, was himself uncomfortable with those lines, especially the Holocaust one as a non-Jew.
Yeah.
And I said, well, as a Jew, I outrank you, and I'm putting your Holocaust joke into your episode.
Right.
I'm going to put a little asterisk on screen that says written by Peter Knight.
Yeah.
But so this was scary. And so, but there was some questions like, well, could we have an alt for the September 11th line? It was like very late in the process, too. It was all animated. It was almost ready to go.
Yeah.
And we're like, okay, shit. And so
it was coming out in August, at the end of August, and that was early July.
It was something. It was like really tight. But then, so then you came back to LA. I remember you were recording like a truck commercial or something. So
Sounds
you,
right.
or like we had like a bunch of alts, and it was like, okay, you can't do something like worse than 100 Hurricane Katrinas, worse than like all these other bad taste jokes.
Yeah.
Which is also a weird thing. So then also I was like trying to protect these jokes. And I was like, look, you think this is edgy? This isn't edgy. Look, Curb Your Enthusiasm does September 11th jokes. So now I'm like arguing that like my own jokes are like hack and like pedestrian and like not edgy at all.
And also you sort of making the argument. It's like, look, I'm not saying that I think that this is okay. I get it. It's a terrible thing to say. But this guy
is the character.
This is a fucked up character who's saying something fucked up. You can't be a fucked up character saying something if he never says something.
And so that was part of a realization for me, actually, that argument, because someone said, the thing about BoJack, what makes him, work, is that he comes right up to the line, but he doesn't cross it. And in that moment, I said, no, he does cross the line, and then he crosses back and kind of goes back and forth. And that's kind of the tap dance of the season and this show, is that we're not saying, he's in the right all the time, or he's saying the things we're all thinking and wish we could say. He is crossing that line. He is going too far. But then we like him anyway because we see his vulnerable side. Like, I want to play with that it's not just, yes, he's always on the right side of this.
And what's relatable about that, and what's always been relatable about this show, given the fact that it's a show about animals, about a horse in a world filled with animals and human, is that people do go over the line and then come back. And people say things and then they say other...
Right, it'd be so easy if we could just write people off forever.
Yeah.
But it's more complicated than that.
It's much more complicated.
And then I remember we called your assistant because we had these new lines, like, when is Will available? Mm-hmm. And your assistant said, well, he's actually at Margarita Mix now recording this truck commercial. Maybe you could, like, get in there, piggyback on top of that.
Yeah.
So we like waited outside, and then I think surprised you. He's like, "Hey, we just wanted to get like 5 of these alts in." Mm-hmm. And so it was worse than the Indonesian tsunami. Like, all this stuff's like, why is this better than September 11th? I don't quite know. Yeah. But we want to have the options.
These are people that we're okay offending.
Right. That was also kind of weird about it. It's like, what are we saying that like it's okay to joke about these people dying, but not those people dying? Yeah. So we ended up keeping the September 11th line, which is a big victory for me, I guess.
I mean, and there are going to be people who are not happy.
But I did have a moment of like fantasy of like the tapes getting mixed up and the truck people getting the alt lines. I was being like, wait, why is BoJack doing this truck commercial? And then being like, what is Will talking about worse than...
Why would he ever... Who would allow this?
Why is this?
You'd think there'd be layers of people.
This is completely inappropriate.
Yeah. Interesting.
But that was the character, and we were still finding it. And I think that was part... And I think a lot of some of those early reactions from critics were like, oh, I don't like this guy. Mm-hmm. And kind of the thing was like, yeah, that's okay.
Yeah.
Like, it's not, because I think there are, especially in animation, there are these kind of jerk-ass characters where the idea is like, because they're funny, you like them anyway,
Yeah.
And I think it feels like that's what we're doing. That like, oh, he's like an asshole, but like, what are you gonna do?
Yeah.
And I think it took a little longer to realize that like, oh no, we are judging him on the show.
Absolutely.
My father was a failed novelist. My mother was the heiress to the Sugarman Sugar Cubes fortune, and my dad resented her for it. He used to make me cry with him while listening to Cole Porter records. He made me build my own tree house, and then he tore it down while I was at summer camp because instead of hardy Christian nails, I used screws, which he called fancy Jew nails. Like I said, totally normal.
I love that you got a guest starring credit.
Alphabetical, so I'm right in the first page.
Unbelievable.
My parents were very thoughtful when they named me Bob Waxberg, because my father, Waxberg, was always at the end of things.
Yeah.
He was like, I want my son to be at the front.
Yeah.
But the problem is that Bob Waxberg is such a confusing last name that people think it's my name.
Yeah, no, I saw you. I saw you trying to explain that to somebody.
No one gets it. It's
on-
so hard. I think Mitch Hurwitz, who I am like pretty friendly with,
Yeah.
and I think still is not 100% sure if it's Bob or Raphael.
Do you really believe that? Is that true?
I don't know. He will not say my name when he sees me in person.
Is that true?
I think he knows, but he doesn't want to risk being wrong. Because I'm definitely that way with a lot of people. I know their name, but I don't want to say it in case it's not their name. I'm just gonna let it go. And I see it in his eye.
I'd like to see you and Mitch together.